A lot of people who like Jesus, but they are very unsure about God.
But the moment the prodigal son looked inward is the moment he came to himself.
I need you, sweet Jesus.
This is Living Truth.
At some point in our lives, we might ask the question, what is God like? We may attempt to understand and explain God with expressions like, He's all-knowing, He's unchanging, He's eternal. But those are rather abstract ideas that may leave us wondering, but what is God like? In today's message, Charles Price walks us through 3 parables in the book of Luke: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Each of these stories paint a picture of what God is like. This is Living Truth.
Well, good morning. What is God like? That must be the second ultimate question a person could ask. The first ultimate question would be, is there a God? And if you answer that there is, then the second most important question is, what is He like? We can try and answer that question by defining God by His attributes of power, that He is all-powerful, that He's all-knowing, that He is everywhere at the same time, that He is unchanging, that He has an eternal beginning. He had no beginning. He always was an eternal end. He'll never have an end. He will always be. We can define God in those terms. And so when I ask, what is God like? I'm not really asking about His attributes. I am asking about His character. Because the ultimate answer to this second ultimate question, which is, what is God like, is God is like Jesus. God Himself is invisible, but the visible revelation and portrayal of God is in Christ. It's not that Christ is like God, but that God is like Christ. In other words, the reference point where we have some tangible, concrete understanding of the character of Jesus Christ is the character of God. As often you see a dichotomy in the minds of many people, maybe some of us here this morning, a dichotomy between what God is like and what Jesus is like. Some people are afraid of God. Very few are afraid of Jesus. In the Old Testament, God is the judge of sinners. In the New Testament, Jesus is the friend of sinners. There are a lot of people who like Jesus, but they are very unsure about God. But God is never not like Jesus. Because if there's some discrepancy in our thinking, God is this, Jesus is that, we understand God through Jesus, not Jesus through God. We know God by knowing Jesus, not the other way around. That's why we don't preach God. We preach Christ. We don't introduce people to God. We introduce people to Christ. In introducing people to Christ, through Him, they get to know God. You want to know God, He says to His disciples, then you need to know me. And if you know me, then, through knowing me, you will know God. Because the only God that there is a God who is Christ-like. And I say that because we understand Christ-likeness and the character embedded in Christ-likeness. A.W. Tozer, in his book, The Pursuit of God, says what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And I want to explore this not abstractly, but over today and also over next Sunday. I want to explore this by looking at this extremely well-known story that Jesus told of the prodigal son. Luke 15 has 3 parables in it, and it begins this way in verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Now there are 2 categories of people here. There's the tax collectors and sinners over here, and they are listening. Then there is the Pharisees and the scribes over here, and they are grumbling. If you went to those 2 groups of people and you said to them, "Who are these spiritual outcasts here?" both will give you the same answer. Pharisees and scribes would say it's the sinners and tax collectors. Sinners and tax collectors say it's us. We're the ones who are spiritual outcasts. If you ask those 2 groups, who are the friends of God here, they would both give you the same answer. It's the Pharisees and scribes. They're the friends of God. They're the professionals. If you asked them, both groups, who is the furthest from God, they would both give you the same answer: tax collectors and the sinners. You see, these 2 groups were in complete agreement about this regarding themselves. They all believe that God cannot look on sin because he is so pure, which fortunately is not true. But that's a bit of a slogan that we sometimes use and that they were familiar with. What they did not know is what Paul wrote in Romans 5:20, where sin abounds, over in this group, grace abounds even more. God is closest to those who know their sin and furthest from those who don't know their sin, which ironically, the ones who don't know their sin are the Pharisees and scribes. The ones who do know are the sinners and the tax collectors. And therefore, every measurement they had as to who are the spiritual outcasts, who are the spiritual ones, was completely wrong. Because those in their sin know their need. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling about Jesus, and they were grumbling because they said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Now, that is quite intense if you unpack exactly what is in that statement. They don't say Jesus is feeding sinners. Now, that might be a good thing to do. At best, feeding people is generous. At worst, it's patronizing. But he's not feeding them. He is receiving them and eating with them. He is hosting them. Feeding somebody and eating with them are 2 different things. And this was the mark of the fact that he was taking them into his turf, if you like, as his friends. And this is what stuck in the throats of the Pharisees and the scribes, that he befriended them, that he identified them. They couldn't see any waggling fingers saying, "You know you're tax collectors and sinners, don't you?" Of course they did. But this led to these parables in Luke 15, 3 of them: a parable of a lost sheep, parable of a lost coin, and the parable of a lost son, as it describes it in my Bible, though actually, as we'll see, it's sons, not son. The parable of a lost sheep, you're familiar with that? The shepherd is counting his sheep in at night. He has 100 sheep. And as he counts them in, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. And the last sheep makes its way in. There's one missing. And this lost sheep is on the outside, over the hills and far away by the time the shepherd picks up that he's missing. And so he goes and looks for it. And then there's the parable of the lost coin. This is a woman in her house, and she has 10 silver coins. She loses one. And she hunts throughout the house for it, lights a lamp, looks under the cupboards, picks up the carpet, sweeps every possible place she knows where it could possibly be, until suddenly she finds it. The sheep is out on the outside, the coin is on the inside. The sheep is conscious it is lost. The coin has no consciousness. It doesn't know it's lost. And these two pictures of looking for the sheep on the outside and then looking for the coin on the inside are then brought together in this parable that Jesus then tells about these two sons. One was on the outside, one was on the inside. One knew he was lost, one did not know he was lost. Verse 11, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. Now, we usually call this the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son, but sons is plural as Jesus tells the story. Now, the story is that the father had these 2 sons, and the younger son said, Father, give me the share of the estate. Give me what belongs to me. Now, there's no further discussion about that. There was no debate that's recorded for us. It simply says, so he divided his property between them. We know how he divided his property. We know why he divided his property the way that he did, because there were laws about it. And he headed off to a distant country. From Israel, the only way to go is east, of course. And he headed off east. Maybe all the attractions of Mesopotamia, which was one of the great civilizations of the day. Maybe the dazzling lights of Babylon drew him. Maybe the culture of Nineveh. Maybe he went further, all the appeal of the Persian Empire. Further beyond. We don't know where he went, but we do know that when he arrived, he was extremely popular. And he squandered his living, his money on extravagant living, on wine, women, song. He accumulated a lot of friends. Cash in your pocket will give you a lot of friends. But then the inevitable happened. The money ran out. Not only that, but it coincided with a famine in the country, and with his money running out and a famine coming into the country, this man was reduced to nothing. Not only no money and no food, but inevitably no friends. He was a cash cow when he was their friend. Now he's of no interest, of no value, and of no concern. And in desperation, he hired himself, it tells us, to a pig breeder who gave him the job of feeding pigs. And he was so hungry, he would have eaten the food the pigs were being fed. Now, you'll appreciate the degradation of this for a Jewish boy. For Jews, pigs were unclean. And here's this Jewish boy, and as Jesus told this story, they got the full impact of this. This Jewish boy is away in a far country. He's in a pig pen. He is with pigs. This is the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the lowest bottom you could be in. Reduced to begging, but no one gave him anything. Alone, far from home, in a pig pen. And then something happened to him that could only really happen once he was in the pig pen. Verse 17 says, when he came to his senses. Some translations say, when he came to himself. You know, we rarely come to ourselves in comfort. We find our real self often in trouble. You see, there's a best about being in trouble, and there's a worst about being in trouble. The worst about being in trouble is being in trouble. The best about being in trouble is that when things that are really important become really important. And he came to himself. You know, God will wait a long time sometimes for people to come to themselves. That's why God lets us go. That's why God doesn't stop us. That's why the father didn't say, no, son, no, this is not smart. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 10%, and then You go and burn that if you like, and come back and I've got the rest for you. So when you're a bit more mature, no, when he asked for it, he let it go. That's why one of the most frightening things that the New Testament teaches about the wrath of God is that the wrath of God is not zap, 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 zap. The wrath of God is saying, I'll let you go. I'll hand you over. Romans 1 talks about them in particular. And it says that God gave people over to lust, to impurity, to dishonor, to a debased mind, to covetousness, to envy, to murder, to foolishness. He gives a whole list of things there that people wanted to go, and God said, okay, go. And his wrath, that's the context of that, is that he lets them go until they find themselves up to their neck in sin and wallowing in a pig pen. Because that's when he can get their attention. And to produce what in this story, the end product is a boy who comes home and who's now transformed, means we have to let them go. And when the father let his son go, no doubt there were tears in his eyes, as there always are, just because your kids are going anyway, but tears in his eyes because I know this boy. I know my son. I'm going to wait for him to come home. The father knew where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And life's far too comfortable for this boy at home. And one day his son would find grace in the pig pen. And that's why in verse 17, he came to his senses. What did coming to his senses involve? What did coming to himself? I like that actually, because a lot of us don't know ourselves really. We create a kind of self-image that we believe ourselves. But when he comes to himself, wow, this is what I'm really like. And he came to himself. What did it involve? In verse 18, he came to himself. He said, I will set out and go back to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. Here's a bit of sheer honesty that this boy now has to face about himself. We can live with an illusion. We can live with a front. We can carefully manage our image before other people. But when you're alone in a pig pen, there's nobody's going to be impressed. No pig is looking to see, are you really a nice boy? He couldn't care less. You're on your own, and you can afford to be honest. And he has to be honest. And his honesty says, I have sinned, I am messed up, I need to go home. He got up to go home, be a long journey home. He'd gone far away. He came back over the roads that he had escaped on. He was hungry. He was alone, nobody with him on the journey. He was a broken young man. He was bankrupt. He had nothing. He was embarrassed. He was full of shame. And here's a wonderful part of the story, verse 20. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Does that mean his father was outside every morning looking down the road? Yes, it probably does mean that. When he let his son go, he took a huge risk. A risk was he would never see his son again. A risk was his son might die doing what he's going to do. He might get beaten up because of his money anyway and robbed on the road. He's out there scanning the horizon. As he did so, he saw a little speck come onto the horizon that wasn't normally there. And as that little speck came slowly along the path, it was bowed. He probably thought to himself, that's a broken man. Wonder where he's going. And then he began to realize his gait. I recognize that. This is my son. And it says he was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him. He kissed him. He didn't stand there and say, oh, here he comes. Okay, so you've come home, huh? What do you do with all that money? What have you been doing? What have you got up to? You punk. That's probably what his son expected. He comes home, he's rehearsed a speech full of apology. It's probably what you and I expect of God, by the way. But God is like Jesus. And Jesus is telling something about himself. Filled with compassion, ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. He didn't say, son, that's great. I'm going to give you a big hug and I kiss him in, but there's a shower over there. Just go and have a quick shower and then come back and I'll kiss a clean boy. No, he kissed the stinky boy. But notice also in that, the father didn't send a camel train to bring him back. He said, there's my son on the horizon. Let's get a horse. And, he's been walking for days and weeks, for miles and miles. Let's give him a ride home. No, son, you'll walk the very last step home. Because you're home not because we brought you home. You're home because you choose to come home. And he began to make his rehearsed speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And before he could finish, the rest of that statement was going to be, make me one of your hired men. Before he could finish that, his father interrupted. The father said to his servant, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, put sandals on his feet. Obviously, he's got blistered feet now. Put sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf. I'll talk about that next week. Not a fattened calf, the fattened calf. This has a specific purpose for which he's kept this fattened calf. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to celebrate. His fathers welcomed him, forgiven him, reinstated him, dressed him. And now celebrating. But then a massive eruption took place. The older son diligently working out in the property. On his way home says, what's the fuss? Why the noise? Why the dancing? Why the celebration? Why the smell of a cooking beef? And the servant says, your brother has come home. And he is so angry and so resentful. We'll talk about him next week. We'll talk about how you get into this place. And we'll be kind to him because we need to understand why he comes in this place. We're not going to just smack him down for this. There's a reason why he's come to this place. But the picture is Jesus saying to these Pharisees and scribes, Pharisees, scribes, are you recognizing the older brother? You're looking into the mirror of the story? Sinners, tax collectors, are you looking into the story and seeing a mirror of yourself? Because that's what God is like. I wonder if somebody here this morning is in a pig pen of some kind. There's a whole lots of pig pens we could be in. Pig pen of greed. Pig pen of lust. Pride. Jealousy. If you're in that pig pen, you're halfway home, provided you'll come to yourself and say, this is disgraceful, this is disgusting. How in the world did I become like this? When you get up and begin to move back home, you'll discover the Father's eyes are watching and waiting, and he'll run to you and celebrate you. There's an old hymn, probably some of you don't know it, but probably some of you have heard it in the past. I'm going to read a couple of verses to you, but it's about what I've talked about. The hymn says, I've wandered far away from God. Now I'm coming home. The paths of sin too long I've trod. Lord, I'm coming home. coming home, never more to roam. Open wide your arms of love, Lord. I'm coming home. My soul is sick, my heart is sore. Lord, I'm coming home. My strength renew, my hope restore. Lord, I'm coming home. Coming home, coming home, never more to roam. Open wide your arms of love, Lord. I'm coming home. Would that be your prayer?
An awareness of self is not always comfortable or easy. It can be simpler to look outwards at other people, at circumstances, at external cues, than to look inward. But the moment the prodigal son looked inward is the moment he came to himself, came to his senses, and realized he needed to go home. He needed to go to his Father. May God give each of us the courage to come home, no matter how far we may have wandered. Join us next time for more clear biblical teaching here on Living Truth. We love to hear from you. Send your comments through our website. Living Truth is supported by viewers like you. Thanks to your financial participation, lives are being transformed through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Living Truth is a registered charity, and donations receive a tax receipt. To watch this message again, visit our website. Download transcripts, order DVDs and CDs, as well as our daily devotional, or sign up for our monthly newsletter. Online, you can sign up for podcasts. You can also join us on Facebook and YouTube. Join us next week for part 2 of this message, Christ-like God. This is Living Truth.
I need you, sweet Jesus. I need you, sweet Jesus. I can always count on you. I need you, sweet Jesus. I need you, sweet Jesus. I can always count on you. When the pain sets in, you wipe my tears. When my faith is gone, you whisper in my ear, I will never leave you alone. I need you, sweet Jesus, and I need you, sweet Jesus. I can always count on you. And I need you, sweet Jesus. And I need you, sweet Jesus. I can always count on you. And always count on you. I can always count